Remember when every pub had a cloud of smoke hanging over the bar and your granddad could tell a person's class by what they smoked? There was a time in Britain when cigarettes weren't just a habit. They were a cultural staple, stitched into everything from wartime rations to bus stop gossip. Today, we're taking a puff from the past to explore 10 cigarette brands that only true Brits remember. Whether you sneaked one behind the shed, nicked one from your uncle's packet, or simply remember the smell clinging to your coat after a bus ride, you're in for a blast of nostalgia. Let's light up the memories and dive right in. Launched in 1965, Players No. 6 was the answer to the growing demand for affordable cigarettes in the UK. It was a cheaper, filtered alternative to the more premium Players Navy Cut, and it didn't take long for it to explode in popularity, especially among young adults and working-class Brits. The No. 6 was easily recognizable thanks to its distinctive blue and white packet, and it had a strong, full-bodied taste that wasn't too smooth, but not harsh enough to put off new smokers either. It became a go-to smoke for the budget-conscious, often seen hanging from the lips of factory workers, lorry drivers, and teens trying their first cig behind the school bike sheds. Price-wise, it was a bargain. In the early 70s, a pack of 20 would cost you around 20 to 25 pence, making it accessible for just about everyone. In 1978, tobacco taxation was harmonized with the EU, and cigarettes were taxed by retail price instead of the weight of the tobacco, which caused a major change in prices. Before, small cigarettes were cheap and big ones were expensive. So king-size cigarettes were a luxury and small ones like Players No. 6 were popular. After the tax change, the price difference between a pack of Players No. 6 and a pack of upmarket Benson & Hedges special filter was almost incidental. 20, no 6, cost 52 pence, and 20 Benson & Hedges cost 57 pence. Overnight sales of No. 6 tumbled, and in the status-conscious 80s, No. 6 simply stopped being popular. And then the brand quietly disappeared in 1993. Camel cigarettes are more famously associated with American smokers, but they also had a pretty solid cult following in the UK throughout the 60s to 80s, particularly among artists, intellectuals, and jazz aficionados who craved something a bit more exotic than the typical British brands. Camel came unfiltered, and the pack's iconic camel and pyramids imagery added a mysterious, almost rebellious edge in contrast to the blue-collar appeal of brands like Woodbine or No. 6. The cigarettes weren't cheap because they were imported and priced higher than domestic brands, so they were rarely seen outside of more urban areas like London, Edinburgh, or Brighton. But those who did smoke them swore by the smoother draw and richer taste, which they believed made them feel like they were smoking something far more sophisticated. Camel did try to push its presence further in the UK during the 80s with filtered versions, but it couldn't really keep up with more affordable, homegrown brands. Today, while Camel still exists globally, but it's largely vanished from British shelves, remembered mainly by those who once smoked them to stand out from the crowd. There was no mistaking a Capstan full-strength cigarette. This brand was not for the faint-hearted, unfiltered, full of flavor, and as strong as a miner's handshake. Capstan was originally produced by W.D. and H.O. Wills and had been around since the early 20th century, but its popularity really surged during and after World War II. These were the cigs your granddad smoked on the docks, or that sailors lit up after a long voyage. In the 50s and 60s, Capstan Full Strength was ubiquitous in working-class communities, especially in port cities like Liverpool, Glasgow, and Bristol. The cigarette was short, stubby, and packed with high-tar, high-nicotine tobacco. One puff, and you'd feel it in your chest for around 40 pence for a pack. In the 1970s, when health warnings became more prominent and filtered cigarettes gained ground, Capstan's reputation as a rough smoke made it less appealing to new generations, especially because it had the highest nicotine content and the second highest levels for tar. Eventually, production for the naval cut with the high levels of nicotine were tapered off, but while the design of the packets sold may have lost their distinctive naval references, tobacco under the Capstan brand remains on the market. Still, ask anyone who smoked Capstan in its heyday, and they'll tell you it was the real deal, a cigarette that separated the men from the boys. In the world of British cigarettes, Embassy was launched in the 1910s by Imperial Tobacco, and it quickly carved out a reputation as one of the most reliable, broadly appealing brands on the market. It truly hit its peak during the 1960s, becoming Britain's top-selling brand from 1964 until 1970, when it was overtaken by Players number 6. At its peak, Embassy had 24% of the market in 1968, and one of its catchiest slogans was, "Inhale to your heart's content." The Embassy packaging had a polished, formal aesthetic, while Embassy Gold was seen as a slightly more premium offering. The taste was medium-bodied, relatively smooth, and not too heavy on the throat. Embassy had a serious advertising budget, with high-profile TV sponsorships, billboards, and even a long-standing loyalty scheme. Collect enough Embassy coupons, and you could order anything from a kettle to a bike. It was as much a lifestyle brand as it was a smoke. By the late 80s, however, the brand began to fade, partly due to rising health awareness and a shift in taste. Embassy still exists today, but the Embassy Gold and Envoy variants that once ruled Britain have largely disappeared. If you remember trading in Embassy coupons or pulling a red and gold pack from a handbag or coat pocket, then you've truly earned your stripes. Woodbine wasn't just a cigarette brand, it was a British institution. Launched in 1888 by Wills, Woodbine's popularity boomed during the World Wars, where it became the unofficial smoke of the British soldier. Cheap, strong, and always available, Woodbines became synonymous with the working-class man, and to many, a symbol of resilience and routine. Known as the poor man's cigarette, Woodbine was unfiltered, with a harsh, smoky taste that delivered a powerful nicotine hit in just a few drags. These weren't made for casual puffers. The flavor was intense, raw, and incredibly tarry, the kind of smoke that left a mark not just on your lungs, but on your fingers. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they were everywhere, and a pack of 10 could be bought for less than a shilling. You'd often find a half-crushed pack tucked into a breast pocket, or a lone Woodbine stubbed out on the pavement outside a pub. Though a filtered version was eventually introduced to keep up with changing tastes, by 1988 it was discontinued. Health campaigns, the rise of filtered imports, and new tastes saw Woodbine having to change its blend, and even though it's still present today, the taste definitely isn't the same as the old Brit smokers can remember. If most British cigarette brands of the mid-20th century were about grit and grunt, Consulate was style and sophistication. Marketed in the 1960s and 70s with the unforgettable slogan, "Cool as a mountain stream," Consulate had a light, minty taste thanks to its menthol core and was very smooth on the throat, a feature that helped it win over women and new smokers who found harsher blends like Capstan or Woodbine too intense. The white and green packet gave it a clean, clinical look. Compared to the earthy or industrial branding of rival smokes, Consulate stood out as fresh, modern, and fashion-forward. Menthol was still a novelty at the time, and Consulate's marketing team did a great job of making it feel almost healthier, or at least less aggressive. Price-wise, Consulate sat in the mid-range. Not as cheap as Players number 6, but not as pricey as something like Dunhill. A pack of 20 would typically cost around 35 to 40 pence in the mid-70s, putting it in reach of younger, trendier smokers. By the late 80s, however, the menthol craze began to wane. It was more like a miniature fad. After 2020, though, menthol cigarettes have been completely banned in the UK. Launched in 1921, Craven A was named after the 3rd Earl of Craven and manufactured by Carreras Lantid, quickly rising to become one of the most recognizable British cigarette brands in the first half of the 20th century. Craven A's defining feature was its smoothness. The filter version became particularly widespread and was seen as a less irritating alternative to harsher unfiltered options. The brand used this to full marketing effect, running decades of advertising built around health-conscious messaging, ironic today, but effective back then. The red, white, and black packaging gave it a bold yet polished look, and the brand was especially popular in the south of England, including London, Surrey, and Kent. By the late 80s, however, its dominance had started to fade. The brand was sold off and eventually disappeared from most UK retailers. While Craven A may still be found in niche markets or overseas, its British chapter has long since closed. Yet for many, the name Craven A still sparks vivid memories of a smoother smoke, vintage adverts, and that unforgettable claim, "will not affect your throat." Based on the formal name and regal packaging, Senior Service was known as a relatively expensive cigarette brand. These were filterless cigarettes owned and manufactured by Gallagher Group, a subsidiary of Japan Tobacco. The brand was named after the nickname of the Royal Navy. Launched in 1925 by J.A. Patrioux Limited and later taken over by Gallagher Group, this brand became a staple in Britain's smoking scene, especially in the 50s to 70s. Senior Service was known for two things: being unfiltered and being strong. It had a bold, full-bodied flavor that hit the throat with force, giving smokers that satisfying burn that many lighter brands lacked. While not quite as throat-rasping as Capstan, it was certainly in the same league. Its tar and nicotine levels were high, making it a favorite among those who didn't care for menthols or milds. The branding leaned heavily on British naval tradition, complete with anchors and flags, evoking a sense of pride, duty, and masculinity. The pack was white, with an orange-blue stripe at the top. A pack of Senior Service in the early 1970s would cost around 50 pence, placing it in the mid to upper price range. It was seen as a premium option compared to other cigarettes. As filters became more popular, Senior Service tried to modernize with a filtered version, but the brand's image was too tied to a fading generation of smokers. By the early 2000s, it was discontinued. Strand is a brand that will forever be remembered, not for its popularity, but for its catastrophic failure in marketing. Launched in 1959 by Wills, Strand was meant to be sophisticated, urban, and cool. The famous ad campaign featured a sharply dressed man wandering through London's empty streets, lighting up a Strand cigarette under moody jazz music. The voiceover whispered, "You're never alone with a Strand." Unfortunately, the public didn't see it that way. Instead of interpreting the ad as stylish or comforting, viewers saw it as depressing and lonely. The man didn't look cool. He looked isolated, like a noir anti-hero down on his luck. Despite huge spending on ads, the brand flopped spectacularly. In fact, it's estimated that only 0.3% male and 0.7% female smokers ever bought a pack, which is a shame, really, because Strand cigarettes weren't actually bad. They had a medium-strength tobacco leaning slightly towards the smoother end, and were designed to appeal to the new generation of thinking man smokers. They were also more expensive than many competitors, adding to the perception of them being elite or aloof. Strand packs were sleek, with minimalist blue and white design, but the brand failed to shake off the image created by that single, ill-fated campaign. Within a year or two, the cigarettes were pulled from shelves. It became a case study in advertising failure, and the phrase, "You're never alone with a Strand," became a kind of sarcastic cultural joke. Still, if you ever saw one of those haunting old adverts, you'll never forget it. And if you ever smoked one, you might be one of the very few Brits who can say they tried the most famously forgotten cigarette of them all. Rothmans was one of those brands that managed to walk the tightrope between style and substance, and in its heyday, particularly the 60s through to the 80s, Rothmans King Size was seen as the cigarette of the refined working man. The old formula of Rothmans was distinctive. It had a strong, slightly sweet flavor, thanks to its carefully blended tobacco and well-balanced nicotine hit. Rothmans were also heavily associated with sports sponsorship, which gave the brand an aspirational feel. The packs were crisp blue and white, exuding quiet confidence rather than flash. And unlike many budget brands, Rothmans weren't sold as a bargain. They were priced a bit higher, with a 20-pack costing about 40 pence in the late 70s, putting them on par with Embassy and above number 6. While the Rothmans name still exists under British American Tobacco, the cigarettes sold today bear little resemblance to the old King Size formula that smokers remember. Changes to tobacco content, reduced tar and nicotine, and rebranding efforts have made it more generic and less distinguished. Those who smoked the original Rothmans King Size often look back fondly, remembering it as the perfect balance of taste, strength, and sophistication, a proper smoke for those who didn't want to compromise. And that's it for today's trip down memory lane. Give it a like if it helped you remember that first puff, and don't forget to subscribe for more nostalgia. See you next time.